Imagine this: you finally pierced the veil. The grand illusions of the world, the relentless chatter of your own mind, the carefully constructed identity you once clung to, they've all crumbled. Maybe it was a seismic spiritual revelation that shook you to your core, or perhaps a quieter, more insidious shattering of everything you thought you were. The ground literally shifted beneath your feet, and what was once intimately familiar suddenly felt alien, distant. You saw behind the curtain, glimpsed the intricate machinery of your conditioned patterns, and recognized the deafening, often distracting noise of the everyday world. And then, almost mercifully, came the silence. At first, this newfound silence probably felt sacred, empowering, like stepping out of a burning, smoke-filled building into crisp, clean air. There was a profound sense of relief, even a touch of euphoria. But then, slowly, subtly, something else began to happen, meaning the very thing that once propelled you forward started to dissolve. It wasn't a dramatic catastrophe, no sudden crash, but more like a quiet, almost imperceptible disappearance, as if your soul had gently dimmed the lights on life and then simply forgot, or perhaps chose not to, turn them back on. You found yourself stopping the endless striving, ceasing the habitual performing, not out of a bleak despair, but from a kind of sacred exhaustion. It was a hollowing out that felt strangely peaceful, yet profoundly unnervingly still. And in that stillness, a whisper began, a quiet, aching question that grew louder with each passing day. I finally see the truth. The illusion is gone. So why on earth do I feel so profoundly empty? If this resonates, if you felt that bewildering void, you're not alone, and you're certainly not broken. In fact, you might be standing on the precipice of the most misunderstood, yet vitally important phase of your entire spiritual journey. The one that feels like you're losing your bearings, when in reality, you're finally being guided home to your truest self. Don't dare misunderstanding this. This, right here, is the monumental paradox that rarely gets a headline in the glossy brochures of spiritual enlightenment. We are so often led to believe, almost conditioned to expect, that a spiritual awakening will automatically inflame our sense of purpose, that seeing through the grand illusion will make us burn with an unshakable clarity and an insatiable drive. We envision ourselves suddenly imbued with boundless energy, ready to charge forth and change the world, or at least our own lives, with newfound vigor. But for a significant number of us, especially those who walk this path with heightened sensitivity, the natural seekers, the empaths, the introspective inward travelers, awakening does something quite different, something almost counterintuitive. Instead of filling us to the brim, it often empties the vessel entirely. It's like a meticulous spiritual excavation, scraping out all the false motives, the ego-driven ambitions, the conditioned desires, until even the very concept of wanting becomes fuzzy and unrecognizable. And in that vast echoing void, it becomes perilously easy to misinterpret this sacred emptying. We can confuse this profound recalibration with apathy, this deep rest with a lack of passion. We might start to believe that the fire of our awakening, which we anticipated would roar, has somehow been snuffed out, leaving us cold and directionless. I recall a poignant conversation with a dear friend, a truly brilliant woman, spiritually attuned and deeply versed in profound texts. She had emerged from what she described as a harrowing, dark night of the soul, with insights so crystalline they were almost blinding. She told me with a quiet conviction how she'd seen through the intricate illusions of personal identity, the hollow chase of achievement, and the often misguided quest for external love. And yet, just a couple of months later, I found her adrift, lying in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, ensnared in a stillness she had never expected. I used to cry, literally cry about not doing enough, not being enough, she confided, her voice barely above a whisper. Now, she paused. Now I honestly don't care if I do anything at all. I genuinely thought awakening would set me on fire with purpose. Instead, I feel extinguished. This experience, this feeling of being put out, is far more common than you might think, and it's a crucial signpost on the path, not a dead end. This disorienting, often terrifying landscape of post-awakening stillness is precisely the terrain that the insightful teacher Shi Heng Yi might observe with profound understanding. He might describe it as the sacred liminal space, that in-between zone marking the collapse of the ego's long-held dominion and the slow, often hesitant birth of the true self. It's a terrifying place in its quietude, a zone where the motivation that was once relentlessly powered by the persona, that carefully constructed mask we wear for the world, and the insatiable hunger for social approval simply dissolves, leaving behind only the raw, unformed clay of what has not yet been shaped into its new, authentic form. Shi Heng Yi might not see this as failure, regression, or some kind of spiritual misstep. Far from it. He might identify this as a critical phase of individuation, the psyche's natural lifelong journey towards wholeness, as some schools of thought term it. Think of it as the chrysalis stage of our psychological development. The old caterpillar self, with all its limitations and familiar comforts, must literally dissolve into a kind of formless goo before the butterfly, with its entirely new way of being and navigating the world, can emerge. This is the psychological death that is absolutely required for a genuine, sustainable rebirth. However, it's vital that we don't mislabel this void as a step backward, as a sign that we've lost our way, because nestled in the very heart of this apparent emptiness, a deeper call is beginning to stir. It's a quiet, almost imperceptible pulse of soul truth, patiently waiting to be heard, to be acknowledged. This isn't the old frantic motivation to prove yourself, to achieve, to be seen. Instead, it's a gentle, intrinsic impulse to simply be, to move not out of a desperate need for recognition or validation, but from a place of deep inner resonance, a quiet alignment with something far more authentic and enduring. This isn't an article about despair. It's an exploration of that pivotal moment after the initial fireworks of awakening, when the old, familiar fuel has run dry and the new, soul-sourced energy is still in the delicate process of forming. As Shi Heng Yi might teach, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This apparent loss of motivation isn't the end of your story. It's the sacred, often messy beginning of learning to live not as a carefully curated mask, but as an authentic, embodied soul. Shi Heng Yi, a figure deeply connected to understanding the inner world, might well have foreseen this strange and silent fog, this peculiar stillness that often descends after the initial blaze of awakening, long before it became a common topic. He might not cloak it in overly mystical or exclusively euphoric language. Instead, he might speak with a piercing, almost uncomfortable clarity about the soul's necessary and often challenging descent into its own uncharted depths. Enlightenment, as some philosophies teach, does not come merely by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And while those words may sound beautifully poetic, they carry a significant truth. Real, transformative awakening doesn't just crown you with perpetual bliss. It strips you. It meticulously unravels the entire scaffolding of the false self, the persona you've spent a lifetime constructing and polishing. It initiates a slow, sacred, and often painful death, the death of who you believed yourself to be. This collapse is profoundly internal, yet its repercussions are far-reaching, touching every aspect of your existence. Your former motives, the relentless ambition, the drive for achievement, the deep-seated need for recognition and validation begin to dissolve like sugar in water. The timelines you once rigidly followed, the goals that once pulled you forward with such compelling force, even the very structures of identity that defined your relationships, your work, your daily rhythm, start to fade like mirages under the intense light of a deeper, more encompassing truth. But here's where the psychological nuance is absolutely vital. Your ego does not simply disappear into thin air. It doesn't die in the way we might imagine. Rather, it becomes profoundly disoriented, like a captain whose ship has suddenly lost its rudder and sails in a storm. The familiar script it once followed with such precision has been unceremoniously burned, but no new script has yet emerged to take its place. The result, therefore, is not true laziness or clinical apathy, but a profound spiritual limbo. You are no longer asleep, lulled by the illusions of the consensus reality, but you are not yet fully awake into what comes next. This is the mystery, the unnerving in-between that some traditions might call the nigredo, the blackening phase in an alchemical process, where the old material has been thoroughly dismantled, but the refined gold of the self has not yet fully taken the throne. In our modern productivity-obsessed terms, it looks suspiciously like demotivation, but in a rich symbolic language, it is a holy pause, an essential in-between space where the soul retreats inward to painstakingly rewrite its core myth, its fundamental story. And yet, our modern culture, with its relentless emphasis on progress, productivity, and perpetual motion, deeply fears this silence, this apparent stagnation. Shi Heng Yi might observe that the modern world does everything in its power to avoid this critical phase, to pathologize it as depression, to numb it with distractions, to medicate it into submission, precisely because it cannot comprehend a transformation that doesn't look like a clear upward trajectory of improvement. But what you may be experiencing, if this resonates, is not regression. It is a profound initiation. It is not a sign of dysfunction. It is a sacred descent into the fertile darkness where new life gestates. This is often not depression in the purely clinical sense, though it may share some of its shadows and somber hues. More accurately, it is the soul, in its wisdom, refusing to continue participating in a life, a game, a charade that it no longer authentically resonates with. And that refusal, that courageous turning away from the false, Shi Heng Yi might suggest, could be the very beginning of individuation, the sacred, lifelong becoming of the true, authentic self. Most people never speak of this part, do they? The ache that follows the dazzling light, the profound silence that descends after the earth-shattering revelation. It's the part that's often missing from heroic tales of spiritual journeys. But this silence, this apparent void, is not empty. It is formative. It is pregnant with potential. And if you can learn to stand still inside it, to truly listen to what it asks of you, to what it requires from you, you may come to see that what looks like a terrifying loss of motivation from the outside is actually the very beginning of a deeper, more sustainable alignment from within. The world, with its superficial judgments, might tell you you're lost, adrift, failing. Shi Heng Yi, with a profound understanding of the psyche's rhythms, might gently say you are being reformed, reshaped by something far more honest, far more real than anything you've known before. And that, my friend, is exactly where the journey truly begins to deepen. If you've been drifting aimlessly through that peculiar, almost surreal haze that so often follows a significant spiritual awakening, staring into the quiet stillness where your familiar spark, your old get-up-and-go, once burned so brightly, please know this with certainty: you are not broken. You are, in fact, undergoing a profound psychic shift, a metamorphosis so deep and pervasive that it doesn't merely challenge your thoughts or beliefs. It reconfigures the very architecture of your inner world. Our culture, by and large, has no adequate name for this state, no respectful framework to understand it, which is why it can feel so isolating. The ambitions that once lit a roaring fire in your chest, the deadlines that once spurred you into action, the meticulously crafted 5-year visions, the motivational mantras of hustle and grind, they now fall flat, utterly devoid of their former power. This isn't because you've somehow failed or lost your way. It's because the very psychic structure that once housed and fueled your motivation is, quite literally, disintegrating. Shi Heng Yi might observe this intricate unraveling. Let us try to understand it clearly, for it holds the key to navigating this bewildering phase. For most of your life, your primary source of energy, your drive, came from what some call the persona, the constructed self, the carefully polished mask you wore to move through the world, to gain acceptance, to achieve success as defined by external standards. That identity, the one who desperately wanted to be admired, validated, perhaps even envied or applauded, was not inherently a flaw. It was, as some philosophies describe, a system of behavior which is imposed upon the individual by the expectations of society, a necessary stage of human development, a kind of psychological scaffolding. But when you truly awaken, you begin to see this mask for what it is: a performance, a role you've been playing. And once the artifice is recognized, the performance no longer compels you with the same force. You simply can't chase applause with the same desperate fervor once you've seen that the stage itself is largely made of illusion. The inevitable result? The goals you once revered, the milestones you once strove for, now feel foreign, almost alien. They were written by a version of yourself that no longer fully resides in you. And this creates an eerie, unnerving silence within, like an actor stepping off a brightly lit stage and suddenly forgetting all their lines. Not out of confusion or memory loss, but because the script itself no longer resonates with the deepest stirrings of their soul. You feel aimless, not because you've truly lost your direction, but because you've shed the identity that required a specific, externally defined destination. You didn't lose your drive. You simply outgrew the superficial fuel that once powered it. What stirs within you now, in this quiet interlude, is not absence or lack, but a sacred pause, a fertile void patiently preparing to be filled by something infinitely truer, something no longer forged from the fires of performance, but born from the quiet wellspring of authentic presence. The ego, with its incessant demands, pushes and prods. The soul, in its profound wisdom, waits, and in that patient, often uncomfortable waiting, something genuinely holy begins to take root. Shi Heng Yi might teach that the ultimate aim of life isn't to endlessly exalt the ego, to polish its facade, or to cater to its insatiable desires. Instead, he might propose that our true purpose lies in integrating the ego into a larger, deeper, more encompassing psychic totality. We are not here merely to serve the ego's fleeting whims and ambitions, but to refine it, to temper its excesses, and, most importantly, to align it with the self, that transcendent numinous center of our being that connects us to the greater whole, to the very fabric of existence. He might call this profound, lifelong journey individuation, or a similar term signifying the courageous, often arduous, movement from a state of fragmentation and internal conflict towards a state of inner unity and wholeness. The goal is not to become the self that is praised and applauded by the world, but to become the self that is undeniably, authentically real. The self, unlike the ego, is utterly unconcerned with external approval or impressive performances. It is not driven by the kind of ambition that seeks worldly power or recognition, but by a deep, resonant alignment with what is true and life-affirming. Its only desire, if we can call it that, is to express what is genuine, what is essential. And so, in the wake of a significant spiritual awakening, the psyche begins a sacred, often unsettling, recalibration. What once felt exciting, compelling, or important may now feel hollow, empty, or even repellent. Your entire system, mind, body, and spirit, begins to instinctively reject everything that feels artificial, forced, or inauthentic. This can manifest in a sudden loss of interest in careers built primarily on insecurity or the need for validation, a discomfort with relationships based on superficial roles or unspoken contracts, or even a feeling of alienation from that vision board you painstakingly crafted from your old self's deep-seated fear of not being enough. This inner purification, this shedding of the false, often feels like a strange and paradoxical mixture of profound liberation and acute disorientation. You're joyfully shedding the heavy skins of the past, but then comes the daunting question, what now takes its place? Shi Heng Yi might caution that many individuals get stuck at this crucial juncture. Some awaken to a degree, and then, fearing the void or misunderstanding its purpose, fall into what is often termed spiritual bypassing. They might try to prematurely transcend the messiness of human experience, mistaking intellectual understanding for embodied wisdom. They may float above the complexities and challenges of life, casually labeling everything an illusion, and attempt to convince themselves and others that nothing truly matters. But a detached aloofness is not the same as genuine, integrated disconnection from what is false. The true self does not want you to disappear from the world or to abdicate your responsibilities within it. It yearns to inhabit the world more fully, more authentically through you. It seeks not a sterile evacuation from life, but a vibrant, messy, joyful incarnation within it. Not a permanent withdrawal into an ivory tower, but a courageous, loving embodiment of truth in action. But before that profound embodiment can fully blossom, there is invariably a threshold to cross, a liminal space to navigate. And Shi Heng Yi might describe it well, though few truly recognize it when they are immersed in its disorienting currents. It is the gray space, the twilight zone that follows the initial blaze of awakening. The void that comes not with ecstatic bliss, but with a quiet, pervasive, and often deeply unsettling bewilderment. It doesn't look poetic from the inside. It doesn't trend well on social media. It often looks like simply sitting quietly while the rest of the world speeds frantically past, feeling utterly unable to articulate the profound and deeply personal transformation you are undergoing. Shi Heng Yi might gently say, "You are not failing, you are merely in between. You have stepped out from under the absolute dominance of the ego, but the self has not yet become your unwavering foundational reality." This liminal space is not a mistake. It is an essential initiation, a necessary descent into the unknown depths that our fast-paced, impatient modern culture has almost no tolerance or understanding for. Stillness is too often misdiagnosed as laziness. A reflective pause is easily confused with debilitating paralysis. Consequently, you might begin to judge yourself harshly, to berate yourself for your lack of progress. And that very judgment, ironically, becomes the thick wall that blocks the new, more authentic energy that your soul is so desperately trying to call home. This phase is sacred. It is chrysalis, not collapse. And if you can find the courage and the patience to stay there, in that uncomfortable unknown, long enough, if you can resist the powerful conditioned urge to either rush frantically back to familiar patterns or to retreat further into fearful isolation, you will eventually begin to feel it, the quiet, persistent, unmistakable pulse of something deeper, something truer, steadily rising from within. The self is not loud or demanding. It doesn't shout for attention, but it is constant, it is patient, and it is waiting for you to learn to trust what cannot yet be fully named, articulated, or understood by the rational mind. Shi Heng Yi might speak of a sacred, often dramatic, reversal of energy that can occur within the psyche, sometimes called enantiodromia in certain psychological circles. It's the natural phenomenon where something, when taken to its extreme, inevitably transforms into its opposite. And nowhere is this principle more strikingly evident than in the often turbulent aftermath of a spiritual awakening. You might find yourself swinging wildly from the manic, ego-driven striving of, "I must do everything, achieve everything, be everything," to the hollow, almost stunned stillness of the soul, whispering, "Why bother doing anything at all? What's the point?" This pendulum swing isn't a sign that you're broken or malfunctioning. It's the psyche's innate wisdom attempting to find a new, more authentic equilibrium, a profound and necessary rebalancing after years, perhaps lifetimes, of imbalance. The psyche, long imprisoned by the relentless demands of performance, external validation, and societal expectation, finally collapses into a state of deep, recuperative rest. This descent, this apparent collapse, is not pathology. It is a profound and sacred initiation. In the rich, symbolic language of myth and archetype, this is the classic journey of the hermit, the deliberate, often solitary withdrawal from the distracting noise of the world that must precede a powerful and authentic rebirth. It is the sacred cocoon, the alchemical goo phase, where the old caterpillar self must completely dissolve into utter formlessness, no longer a crawling limited self, but not yet the winged liberated one. It's an unstructured, undefined, and seemingly unproductive state by every modern metric of success and efficiency, yet it is absolutely essential because the psyche is undergoing a profound alchemical transformation. And transformation, Shi Heng Yi might insist with unwavering conviction, begins in darkness, not in superficial spiritual bypassing, not in the relentless pursuit of good vibes only, but in a courageous, unflinching descent into what is, including the uncomfortable, shadowy aspects of our being. This is precisely where much of modern, popularized spirituality can lose its profound depth and transformative power, by glamorizing the dazzling light of awakening while subtly, or sometimes overtly, avoiding its necessary crucifixion, its confrontation with the unintegrated shadow. Shi Heng Yi might also emphasize that the shadow, those rejected, uncomfortable, often shamed unconscious parts of ourselves, is not something to be escaped, conquered, or eradicated, but something to be patiently, compassionately integrated into a larger, more complete sense of self. Shadow work, therefore, isn't some advanced level, optional spiritual practice for the elite. It is the very foundation of becoming whole, of becoming truly human. And in this state of apparent nothingness, this void that you may now occupy, the unconscious is rising to the surface, not as a terrifying villain to be vanquished, but as a wise messenger bearing crucial information. What you once repressed, perhaps for decades, your unacknowledged grief, your righteous and long-suppressed rage, your deeply unmet childhood needs, your hidden vulnerabilities, begins to surface because finally, at long last, there is enough space, enough stillness for it to be seen, heard, and felt. The ego, understandably, panics. It desperately wants action, clarity, a familiar name tag, a defined role, a predictable script. But the self, the deeper intelligence within, quietly and persistently whispers, "Let go. Trust the process. I am forming something deeper, something truer, something far more resilient." And this, right here, is where the real, often unglamorous, inner work begins. Not in flashy external achievements, but in profound, moment-to-moment surrender. Not in a desperate, anxious striving for immediate clarity, but in patiently, compassionately witnessing whatever unfolds within the vast landscape of your inner world. Your psyche is not malfunctioning. It is courageously metabolizing years, perhaps lifetimes of accumulated noise, pervasive illusion, and deeply ingrained false striving. It intentionally, wisely, halts your old, familiar drive, your conditioned ambition, your manufactured hunger, so that you have no choice but to sit quietly with what you've buried, what you've ignored, what you've run from. It is in that very stillness, in that hauntingly beautiful and fertile void, that you begin to truly remember who you are beneath all the layers. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, something new, something fresh, something undeniably authentic begins to stir. A different form of motivation, a new quality of energy slowly but surely arises. But it is nothing like the old frantic anxiety-driven energy. It is not urgent, demanding, or performative. It doesn't roar for attention. It hums with a quiet, confident resonance. It's a soul-led impulse to move, to create, to be, to express, not because you must prove something to the world or to yourself, but because it would feel like a profound betrayal of your deepest, most sacred truth not to. Shi Heng Yi might call this the emergence of the self, not as an abstract philosophical ideal or a distant spiritual goal, but as a living, breathing, internal compass, a guiding presence within. It does not chase, it calls, and what it calls you toward is not mere worldly success or fleeting external validation, but an undeniable, resonant, and deeply satisfying wholeness. So, you've bravely crossed that daunting threshold, you've stood firm and observant in the disorienting silence, and you've tasted a profound stillness that is not stagnation, but a sacred, pregnant pause, full of unseen potential. You've wandered, perhaps for a considerable time, through the inner night, that shadowy landscape where no familiar voice called out your name and no external light reliably showed the way. And now, something ancient, something profoundly wise and deeply embedded within your very being begins to stir. It's not a dramatic roar of triumph, not a sudden lightning bolt of definitive inspiration, but rather a quiet, persistent inner knowing, a soft, consistent pulse that doesn't frantically urge you to return to what was, to rebuild the old familiar structures. Instead, it gently, lovingly invites you to begin building what has never yet been, to co-create a life aligned with your deepest truth. This is the first true whisper of the self, communicated not in grand, elaborate pronouncements, but in subtle feelings, in an undeniable intuitive pull, in a palpable quality of peaceful, grounded presence. Shi Heng Yi might call this profound way of being the symbolic life or something similar, a life no longer ruled exclusively by the dictates of the ego or the pressures of societal convention, but increasingly guided by the deeper, often mysterious and infinitely wise forces of the soul. Once the ego has learned to gracefully surrender its absolute dominion, and the unconscious is honored not as a dark, unruly basement, but as a rich source of wisdom and guidance, life ceases to be a relentless, anxiety-ridden game of survival and instead blossoms into an unfolding tapestry of profound meaning and purpose. And here's the beautiful, often overlooked paradox. When the self begins to truly lead, your life may look wonderfully, deceptively ordinary from the outside. You no longer hustle with frantic energy. You learn to respond with mindful presence. You're no longer driven by the pervasive fear of missing out, FOMO, that gnawing anxiety that you're not doing enough or being enough. Instead, you're moved by the quiet, unshakable conviction of inner alignment, a deep sense of rightness that emanates from your core. You stop chasing clarity as if it were some elusive prize to be won through sheer effort, and you begin recognizing it when it naturally arrives, often dressed in the humble, unassuming garments of simplicity, in the quiet moments of everyday life. Living from the self doesn't mean you'll suddenly be perpetually energized, constantly blissful, or always certain about every step. Fatigue, doubt, grief, and confusion are still very much part of the rich, complex texture of human existence. They are not signs of spiritual failure. But what begins to significantly diminish and eventually disappear is the constant nagging ache of self-betrayal, that dull, chronic exhaustion that comes from performing a version of yourself that no longer fits, that perhaps never truly did. Instead, something fundamental, something foundational shifts within your being. You find yourself creating, expressing, sharing, even when no one is there to applaud or validate your efforts. You discover a newfound strength and clarity to say no to what drains you or feels inauthentic, even when yes is expected or would be socially easier. You begin to follow the gentle, often playful nudges of wonder and genuine curiosity rather than obsessively ticking off boxes on a preordained, externally imposed list. You start consistently and consciously choosing peace over performance, authenticity over approval, meaning over materialism. This is not inertia or laziness, it's an entirely new, sustainable fuel source, not the fleeting rush of adrenaline, but the deep wellspring of alignment, not the crushing weight of external pressure, but the lightness of authentic presence. Shi Heng Yi might refer to this profound shift as living symbolically, or living from a place of deep inner knowing, not as an escape into mere fantasy or wishful thinking, but as a courageous, wholehearted return to the soul's native language, its innate wisdom. You begin to trust and even actively cultivate the subtle communications of your dreams, the unerring wisdom of your gut instincts, the profound guidance embedded in meaningful synchronicities, and the personal power of symbols that resonate deeply within your unique psyche. Your life transforms from a desperate monologue shouted into an indifferent void, into a rich, ongoing, and deeply rewarding dialogue with the unseen currents of existence, with the mystery itself. And what does this look like in practical day-to-day terms? Sometimes it's as subtle yet profound as asking entirely different kinds of questions. Not the old, ego-driven, what should I do to succeed, be accepted, get ahead, but the soul-centered, what is quietly, persistently, and lovingly calling me from within. Not, what's the grand, impressive plan I need to concoct, but where is life in its infinite wisdom gently nudging me now in this very moment? Not the exhausting, how can I prove myself and finally gain the recognition I crave, but the liberating, what feels undeniably, authentically true to my core, right here, right now. You stop trying to dominate, control, or manipulate life, and you start, with humility and grace, participating with it, co-creating with its flow. Ambition, in its old egoic form, doesn't necessarily vanish entirely. Rather, it undergoes a profound and beautiful transformation. It alchemizes into devotion, a deep, unwavering devotion to what is real, what is true, what brings you genuinely, vibrantly alive, and what allows you to contribute your unique gifts to the world. And strangely, powerfully, that very devotion, born not of fear but of love, moves mountains. It gets things done, often with surprising ease and grace, but from a place of overflowing wholeness, not depleting striving. Now your actions are sustainable because they are nourished from within. Now they are truly soul-powered. This is the self's intrinsic motivation, not to impress the world, but to authentically express its unique essence through you. And it leads you, often without forceful effort or elaborate planning, to create, to teach, to heal, to serve, to love. Not because you feel you should or because it's expected of you, but because your whole being, every cell, every fiber, resonates with a deep, unequivocal, and joyful yes. So, if you've been anxiously wondering, perhaps even despairing, about where your once familiar spark went after that profound, life-altering awakening, please take a deep breath and remember this with all your heart. It's not gone. It hasn't been extinguished. The old, often ego-driven and perhaps unsustainable fire simply burned away as it needed to make space for a deeper, more enduring, and infinitely more authentic flame to emerge. One that won't flicker out or be easily doused by the inevitable storms and challenges of the world. Shi Heng Yi, with his profound understanding of the human journey, might never promise an easy path, a life devoid of struggle. But he might teach, and his wisdom might beautifully illuminate, a path of profound depth, meaning, and ultimately, wholeness. If you are here, reading these words, engaging with these ideas, then you are already, consciously or unconsciously, walking that sacred path. This seemingly confusing or demotivated phase is not the end of your awakening journey. It is, in many vital ways, the true, unglamorous, and deeply personal beginning of your authentic becoming. If something within this message has stirred you, if even a single phrase or idea has mirrored your own, often unspoken inner experience, I warmly and genuinely invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments below. Have you perhaps encountered that rare and precious soul whose very presence feels like coming home, a balm to your spirit? Or are you, like so many of us,